Sometimes the door that closes in your face is the same door that reveals who truly belongs inside. The words would not mean much to most people standing in the parking lot that cold Tuesday morning. But before the day was over, an entire dealership would learn exactly how true they were. Jake Sullivan adjusted the collar of his worn work shirt and looked through the glass entrance of Harrison Luxury Motors. The dealership stood like a monument to success. Polished vehicles gleamed beneath bright lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the morning sun. Customers walked through the showroom carrying confidence, expensive watches, and expectations. Jake carried something else. A folded resume. A toolbox sitting in the bed of his aging pickup truck. And the responsibility of raising his 12-year-old daughter alone. Beside him, Lily Sullivan sat quietly in the passenger seat finishing the last few bites of a granola bar. "You nervous?" she asked. Jake smiled. "A little. That means yes." He laughed softly. "You know me too well." Lily grinned. "I had a good teacher." The answer warmed him more than the coffee in his hand. Life had not been easy during the past few years. Temporary jobs, contract work, long hours, unexpected bills. Yet somehow they always found a way forward. Today mattered because this job could finally provide stability, health insurance, predictable hours, a future that felt less uncertain. Jake stepped out of the truck and looked toward the dealership entrance once more. "Wish me luck." Lily smiled. "You do not need luck." Jake raised an eyebrow. "No, you are the smartest person I know." For a brief second, emotion touched his face. Then he nodded. "I will be right back." The showroom doors opened with a soft mechanical sound. Warm air greeted him immediately. The scent of leather and polished surfaces filled the space. Sales representatives moved between customers with practiced confidence. Large screens displayed promotional videos. Everything looked perfect. Jake approached the reception desk. "Good morning," he said politely. "I am here about the service department position." The receptionist smiled. "One moment." A few minutes later, the service manager appeared. His name tag read Greg Walters. He glanced at Jake's clothes, then at the folded resume, then back at Jake. The entire evaluation seemed to take less than 3 seconds. "You are here for the technician opening?" Greg asked. "Yes, sir." Greg nodded slowly. "Experience?" "Quite a bit." Jake handed over the resume. Greg barely looked at it. "We already filled the position." Jake blinked. "The listing was active this morning." It changed. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Jake maintained his composure. "Would it be possible to leave my information?" Greg handed the resume back without opening it. "I do not think that will be necessary." Silence settled between them. Not loud silence. The kind that feels heavier because everyone understands what is happening. Jake looked at the untouched resume in his hand, then at the manager. "Understood." Greg nodded. "Good luck." The conversation was over. Just like that. No interview. No questions. No opportunity. Jake thanked him anyway and turned toward the exit. Outside, Lily immediately recognized the expression on her father's face. "That bad?" she asked quietly. Jake climbed into the truck and forced a small smile. "They are going in another direction." Lily stared at the dealership through the windshield. "Did they even talk to you?" Jake did not answer right away. The silence said enough. Lily looked down at her hands. "That is not fair." Jake started the engine. Life is not always fair. Yet even as he said the words, something unusual caught his attention. Through the dealership's glass walls, several employees had gathered around a luxury vehicle inside the service area. Their expressions looked tense, concerned, frustrated. Jake watched for only a moment before one technician threw his hands into the air and walked away. Another shook his head. Whatever problem they were facing, nobody seemed happy about it. Jake narrowed his eyes slightly. Then something deep inside him stirred. Not hope, not anger, recognition. Because sometimes the most important stories begin immediately after someone tells you that you do not belong. Jake started the truck, but did not pull away immediately. Through the windshield, he continued watching the activity inside the dealership. The technicians gathered around the luxury vehicle looked frustrated. One walked away shaking his head. Another pointed toward an open engine compartment while speaking to a service advisor. Even from the parking lot, the tension was obvious. Lily noticed where her father was looking. "The car?" she asked. Jake nodded slightly. "Something is wrong. A lot wrong." He smiled faintly. "Hard to tell from here." Lily studied him for a moment. Then she asked the question that stayed with her long after the dealership disappeared in the rearview mirror. Dad, why do people decide so fast? Jake kept his eyes on the road. What do you mean? The manager. She looked out the passenger window. He barely talked to you. Jake remained quiet. Traffic moved steadily through the morning streets. Sunlight reflected from office buildings and storefront windows. The city continued its routine, completely unaware of the conversation taking place inside an aging pickup truck. Maybe he already had someone else in mind, Jake finally said. Lily frowned. You do not believe that. Jake smiled softly. You always know when I am pretending. Because you are bad at it. That earned a laugh. The sound felt good. Lately, there had not been enough reasons to laugh. Lily looked down at her backpack. I just do not understand. Understand what? How people can decide who someone is without even talking to them. The question settled heavily between them. Jake wished he had a perfect answer. Years ago, he might have tried to explain it. Now he understood that some lessons revealed themselves only through time. Sometimes people see what they expect to see, he said quietly. Lily stared out the window. That seems unfair. It can be. For several blocks, neither spoke. Yet Jake found himself thinking about the question. Not because it came from a child. Because it came from a child who had accidentally described a problem many adults never recognized. People often saw uniforms before character. Circumstances before ability. Appearances before truth. By the time they reached Lily's school, her mood had improved slightly. She gathered her books and paused before opening the door. You are still smart, you know. Jake smiled. Thank you. Even if they did not notice. The words followed him long after she disappeared through the school entrance. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Jake completed a small repair job across town and spent part of the afternoon helping a local garage organize equipment. Temporary work. Honest work. Necessary work. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the dealership. More specifically, to the vehicle surrounded by worried technicians. Around 3 o'clock, another contractor called to postpone a scheduled project. That left Jake with unexpected free time. He stopped at a small coffee shop and reviewed employment listings on his phone. Most openings offered low pay. Others required relocation. None felt right. As he stared at the screen, his mind wandered again. Not toward the rejection, toward the vehicle. Something about the scene he witnessed continued bothering him. The frustration on the technicians' faces. The repeated discussions. The sense that everyone was searching for an answer. Jake closed his phone and shook his head. It was not his problem. He reminded himself of that several times. Yet experience had taught him something important. When talented people become stuck, they often stop looking at the problem and start defending their conclusions. By late afternoon, he returned to the area near Harrison Luxury Motors to pick up a part from a nearby supplier. As he drove past the dealership, he noticed the same luxury vehicle still occupying a service bay. The technicians were still gathered around it. Hours later, Jake slowed slightly, then continued driving. But a strange feeling lingered. Recognition. Not certainty. Not confidence. Recognition. The feeling that he had seen something familiar. Something important. And as the sun slowly lowered across the Chicago skyline, Jake Sullivan realized he was no longer thinking about the job he did not get. He was thinking about a problem nobody inside that dealership seemed able to solve. The next morning began with rain. Thin gray clouds stretched across the Chicago skyline, turning the city into a landscape of reflections and muted colors. Jake Sullivan drove Lily to school in silence, both of them still carrying thoughts from the previous day. The rejection should have been the story. A father needing work. A dealership refusing to give him a chance. Yet somehow neither of them could stop thinking about the vehicle sitting inside Harrison Luxury Motors. You are thinking about it again, Lily said as they waited at a red light. Jake smiled faintly. About what? The car. He laughed softly. Am I that obvious? Very. Jake shook his head. Maybe I am curious. Lily looked out the window. Curious people get into trouble. Sometimes. And sometimes. Jake glanced at her. Sometimes they find answers. The light changed. Traffic moved forward. Yet the conversation stayed with him throughout the morning. After dropping Lily at school, Jake headed toward another temporary job repairing equipment for a small warehouse company. The work was straightforward. Replace worn components. Inspect electrical systems. Complete paperwork. Tasks he could do almost without thinking. Which was unfortunate, because thinking was exactly what he kept doing. Around noon, He stopped for lunch at a diner across the street from Harrison Luxury Motors. The location was accidental. At least that was what he told himself. Through the restaurant window, he could see part of the dealership property. Customers entered and exited the showroom. Sales representatives moved across the lot. Yet one thing had not changed. The same luxury vehicle remained inside the service department. 2 full days later, Jake stirred his coffee slowly. Still there, he murmured. An older waitress refilled his cup. You talking about that fancy car? Jake smiled. Maybe. She laughed. Those mechanics have been chasing that problem all week. Jake looked up. Really? My nephew works there. She nodded toward the dealership. Says nobody can figure it out. Jake thanked her and returned to his thoughts. The comment should not have mattered. Yet it did. Because the longer the problem remained unsolved, the more convinced he became that everyone was looking in the wrong direction. Later that afternoon, another contractor canceled a scheduled project. The unexpected opening left Jake with several free hours. Most people would have gone home. Most people would have moved on. Jake found himself parking across the street from the dealership instead. He stayed inside the truck, watching, observing. Not because he expected anything to happen, because something felt familiar. Through the large service bay windows, he could occasionally see technicians moving around the vehicle. Diagnostic equipment surrounded it. Tool carts stood nearby. Frustration seemed to follow everyone who approached it. Then, just before 4 o'clock, something happened. A technician opened the hood while another reviewed data on a tablet. Jake could not hear the conversation. He did not need to. One brief glance was enough. His eyes narrowed immediately. There it was again. The same detail he noticed on the first day. Small, easy to dismiss, yet impossible for him to ignore. Jake sat forward in his seat. His heartbeat quickened slightly. Not because he suddenly knew the answer, because he recognized the pattern. The kind of pattern experience teaches you to trust. Years ago, before life changed direction, he had spent thousands of hours solving problems exactly like this. Complex systems, hidden causes, symptoms mistaken for failures. The memory felt strangely distant now, yet not distant enough. His phone buzzed. It was a text message from Lily. How was your day? Jake smiled. He typed back immediately. Interesting. A few seconds later, her reply appeared. That means something happened. Jake laughed quietly. She knew him too well. He looked back toward the dealership, toward the vehicle, toward the technicians still searching for answers. Then he made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a reckless one. Simply a decision to pay closer attention. Because deep down, Jake Sullivan was beginning to suspect that the dealership, which refused to learn anything about him, was about to discover exactly who he really was. That evening, after picking Lily up from school, Jake drove home through streets glowing beneath rows of amber streetlights. The city seemed calm, ordinary, yet his thoughts refused to settle. Long after dinner, long after Lily finished her homework, long after the neighborhood became quiet, he sat at the small kitchen table reviewing memories he had spent years trying not to revisit. You are thinking again, Lily said from the doorway. Jake looked up and smiled. Maybe. She laughed softly. You always say maybe when the answer is yes. Jake nodded. Fair point. Lily walked over and sat across from him. Is it about the dealership? A little. The car. Jake hesitated. Mostly the car. Lily studied him carefully. You know something, do not you? Jake leaned back in his chair. The question was simple. The answer was complicated. Because what he knew was not really knowledge. Not yet. It was experience. Pattern recognition. The quiet voice that appears after spending years solving problems other people considered impossible. I think I have seen something similar before, he admitted. Lily smiled. I knew it. Jake laughed. You always know. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. Inside, the small house felt warm and peaceful. For a moment, Jake looked around the room. The photographs on the shelf. The school projects hanging on the refrigerator. The ordinary details that had become the center of his life. Years ago, everything looked different. Years ago, his name had appeared in industry magazines. Companies competed for his time. Conferences invited him to speak. Engineers called him when difficult problems refused to cooperate. Then life changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. One difficult season followed another. Priorities shifted. Ambitions faded. What remained was Lily. And somehow that had become enough. The next morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Jake spent the first half of the day helping a repair contractor on the south side of the city. The work kept his hands busy but left his thoughts free to wander. Around noon, he found himself driving past Harrison Luxury Motors again. This time he did not stop. Yet he noticed something immediately. More employees stood around the same service bay. More technicians. More discussions. Whatever problem they were facing had grown larger. By late afternoon, curiosity finally won. Jake parked across the street and watched for several minutes. A service advisor exited the building carrying paperwork. Two technicians followed. Their conversation appeared animated. Frustrated. One pointed back toward the vehicle. Another shook his head. Then a third technician emerged carrying diagnostic equipment. Jake narrowed his eyes. The scene looked familiar. Not because of the vehicle itself. Because of the people. He recognized the expression. The moment when talented professionals become trapped inside a conclusion. The moment when every new piece of information gets forced to support an assumption instead of challenge it. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. A nearly identical situation from years earlier. Different vehicle. Different company. Same symptoms. Same frustration. Same overlooked detail. Jake sat forward in his seat. His heartbeat quickened. Not because he suddenly had the answer. Because the pattern was becoming clearer. Much clearer. His phone vibrated. A message from Lily appeared on the screen. "How was your day?" Jake smiled. Then typed back 3 simple words. "Starting to understand." A few seconds later, her reply arrived. "About the car?" Jake stared at the message and laughed quietly. She truly knew him better than anyone. He looked back toward the dealership one more time. Toward the technicians. Toward the service bay. Toward the opportunity that no longer felt accidental. For the first time since being turned away at the front desk, Jake realized something important. The rejection had not removed him from the story. Somehow, without anyone noticing, it had placed him directly in the middle of it. The next morning began differently. Jake noticed it before he even reached the dealership. More vehicles occupied the parking lot. More employees moved between buildings. Something important was happening. He had planned to drive past and continue toward another temporary job, but traffic slowed near the entrance. As he waited at a stoplight, several black SUVs rolled into the dealership. Employees immediately straightened their posture. Managers appeared from different departments. Conversations stopped. Jake watched the unusual activity with curiosity. "Special visitor?" he murmured to himself. Across the property, Greg Walters hurried through the showroom carrying a tablet and several folders. The same manager who had dismissed Jake in less than a minute now looked nervous. Very nervous. The answer arrived moments later. A woman stepped out of the lead SUV. She wore a tailored charcoal business suit and walked with calm confidence. Nobody needed to announce her arrival. The reaction of everyone around her said enough. Employees greeted her. Managers followed her. Department heads adjusted schedules. She was clearly someone important. Jake had no idea that he was looking at Charlotte Hayes, the chief executive officer of the entire dealership group. Inside Harrison Luxury Motors, Charlotte moved through the building with quiet attention. Unlike executives who focused only on reports, she paid attention to people. She noticed details, expressions, attitudes. The atmosphere inside the service department immediately caught her attention. "What is happening here?" she asked. Greg forced a smile. "Minor technical issue." Charlotte glanced toward the service bay. Minor issues usually do not involve half the department. Greg hesitated. "We have a vehicle presenting unusual diagnostic challenges." Charlotte nodded slowly. "How long?" "Several days." "Cost?" Greg mentioned a number. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "That much." The answer alone told her the situation was serious. Meanwhile, Jake remained parked across the street longer than he intended. He watched technicians moving around the same luxury vehicle. He watched managers entering and exiting the service area. He watched the executive who seemed determined to understand the problem personally. Something about the scene felt significant. Then his phone rang. Another contractor canceling another project. The unexpected schedule change left him with the entire afternoon free. Jake ended the call and laughed quietly. Interesting timing. By noon, Charlotte had reviewed reports, spoken with technicians, and listened to multiple explanations. None satisfied her. Every answer seemed incomplete. Every diagnosis felt uncertain. The more she listened, the more frustrated the experts became. Not because she challenged them unfairly, because she kept asking questions they could not answer. What started the failure? She asked. Silence. What evidence confirms the sequence? More silence. What assumption are we treating as fact? Nobody responded immediately. Charlotte folded her arms. Then we still do not understand the problem. Across the room, several technicians exchanged uneasy looks. Outside, Jake sat in a nearby coffee shop reviewing job listings. Yet his attention kept drifting toward the dealership windows. The same vehicle, the same confusion, the same unanswered questions. Eventually, curiosity pushed him to walk across the street. Not into the showroom, just near the entrance. He told himself he was stretching his legs. Deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted one more look. Through the glass, he could see the service bay clearly. Charlotte stood beside the vehicle while technicians explained another theory. Jake studied the engine compartment from a distance. Then something happened. One technician opened a diagnostic display. The screen became visible through the bay window for only a few seconds. Yet that was enough. Jake stopped walking. His eyes narrowed immediately. There it was. The detail. The same detail nobody seemed willing to question. Suddenly the pattern became clearer than ever. He did not have every answer, but he now knew exactly where the wrong assumption lived. A strange feeling settled over him. Not excitement. Not satisfaction. Certainty. For the first time since this story began, Jake Sullivan was no longer wondering whether the experts had missed something. He was wondering whether anyone inside that building would be willing to listen. Jake stood outside the dealership for several long seconds, staring through the glass toward the service bay. The answer felt close now. Close enough to touch. Yet experience had taught him that being correct and being heard were two very different things. He turned to leave, then stopped. Through the showroom windows, he saw Charlotte Hayes walking away from another discussion with the technicians. Her expression said everything. Frustration, curiosity, determination. She was not satisfied with the answers she had been given. Jake looked at the dealership entrance, then back at the parking lot, then at the service bay again. Finally, he made a decision. A few moments later, he stepped through the front doors for the second time that week. The receptionist recognized him immediately. Before she could speak, Jake smiled politely. "I am not here about the job." She looked surprised. "Then how can I help you?" Jake glanced toward the service department. "I was hoping to speak with someone about the vehicle." Her confusion deepened. Before she could answer, Greg Walters appeared from a nearby hallway. The moment he saw Jake, his expression tightened. "You again?" Jake remained calm. "Just for a minute." Greg crossed his arms. "We are busy." "I know." "Then this is not a good time." Jake nodded. "Probably not." The conversation might have ended there. It almost did. Then Charlotte's voice interrupted from across the showroom. "What is going on?" Greg turned immediately. "Nothing important." Charlotte approached anyway. Her eyes moved from Greg to Jake, then back again. "I decide what is important." Greg forced a smile. "This gentleman came in earlier this week about an open position." Charlotte looked at Jake. And he is asking about the vehicle." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Charlotte studied Jake carefully. Unlike Greg, she did not seem interested in his clothes. She did not seem interested in appearances at all. She looked interested in something else. Confidence. Not arrogance. Confidence. "You know something about it?" she asked. Jake chose his words carefully. "I think I might know where everyone should look." Greg immediately shook his head. "With respect, our technicians have spent days on this." Jake nodded. "I know. They are highly trained professionals." "I believe that." Greg seemed irritated by how calmly Jake answered. Charlotte remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked a simple question. "How much time do you need?" Jake glanced toward the service bay. 5 minutes. Greg almost laughed. 5 minutes. Jake shrugged. "Either I see something useful or I do not." The manager looked toward Charlotte. "This is ridiculous." Charlotte continued studying Jake. Something about him felt different. Most people in this situation would have tried to impress her. Most would have exaggerated. Most would have talked too much. Jake did none of those things. He simply stood there with quiet certainty. Finally, Charlotte made her decision. "Give him 5 minutes." Greg blinked. "You are serious?" "Very." Several employees exchanged surprised looks. News traveled quickly through the building. Within minutes, technicians gathered near the vehicle. Curiosity spread across the service department. The man who had been rejected at the front desk was now being escorted into the service bay. Jake walked toward the vehicle while Charlotte followed beside him. Greg remained behind, clearly unconvinced. The technicians watched carefully as Jake approached the open engine compartment. For several moments, he said nothing. He simply looked, observed, listened. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Then Jake pointed toward a specific section of the diagnostic data displayed on a nearby monitor. "Can you show me the original sequence?" One technician frowned. "Why?" "Because I do not think this started where you think it started." Another technician crossed his arms. "What makes you say that?" Jake pointed toward the screen again. "This response appears too early." The room became silent. Not because anyone agreed, because nobody had expected that answer. One technician opened additional records. Another pulled up archived diagnostic logs. Charlotte watched closely. Greg looked increasingly uncomfortable. Jake remained calm. Then he pointed to another entry. "There." A technician leaned closer. "Wait." Another technician stepped forward. "Pull that up." The data appeared on the monitor. Several people stared at it. Nobody spoke. For the first time all week, the conversation inside the service bay was no longer about defending conclusions. It was about asking questions. And as Charlotte watched the expressions of her technicians slowly change from confidence to curiosity, she realized the quiet man standing beside the vehicle might have just given them the first real lead they had seen in days. The service bay remained silent for several seconds after Jake pointed at the diagnostic records. Technicians leaned closer to their monitors. Screens changed. Data tables expanded. Archived logs appeared. What began as simple curiosity quickly became focused attention. Charlotte Hayes watched the room carefully. The atmosphere had changed. For days, every conversation centered on defending conclusions. Now people were asking questions. Real questions. Greg Walters stood near the back of the group with his arms crossed. He still looked unconvinced. "It is one line of data," he said. "That does not change everything." Jake nodded calmly. "Maybe not." One technician scrolled through additional records. Another compared timestamps. A third began reviewing system responses from earlier tests. Then one of them frowned. "Hold on." The room grew quiet again. "What?" another technician asked. The first technician pointed toward the screen. "This event happened before the sequence we have been using." Several people stepped closer. Charlotte moved beside them. "Show me." The technician highlighted a section of data. "If this timestamp is accurate, the system responded to something else first." Greg shook his head. "That could be a logging issue." "Maybe," the technician admitted. "But if it is not, our entire diagnostic path changes." Jake said nothing. He simply watched. Experience had taught him that discoveries were strongest when people reached them themselves. Another specialist opened a separate report. Then another. Within minutes, 3 different screens displayed the same pattern, the same inconsistency, the same overlooked detail. Charlotte looked from one monitor to the next. "You are all seeing this." Several technicians nodded. One finally spoke. "We may have started from the wrong assumption." Nobody in the room seemed comfortable saying it out loud. Yet everyone understood what it meant. Days of work, dozens of tests, hundreds of pages of reports, all built on a foundation that might be incomplete. Greg rubbed his forehead. "Run everything again." Nobody argued. New diagnostics began immediately. Tool carts rolled across the floor. Additional data was pulled from archives. Technicians who had been preparing to leave for the evening returned to their workstations. Energy filled the service department. Not frustration, determination. Charlotte stepped away briefly and found Jake standing near the edge of the bay. "How did you notice it?" she asked quietly. Jake shrugged. "The timeline never felt right." "You saw that through a window?" He smiled faintly. "Partly." Charlotte looked at him carefully. "And the rest?" Jake glanced toward the technicians. The problem looked familiar. Charlotte sensed there was much more to the story than he was saying. Yet she respected the fact that he was not trying to impress anyone. Most people would have turned the moment into a speech. Jake preferred silence. Hours passed. Evening sunlight faded behind the skyline. The dealership should have been closing. Instead, more employees gathered around the service area. Word had spread throughout the building. The rejected applicant had identified something the experts missed. Nobody said it openly, but curiosity was everywhere. Around 7 o'clock, a technician suddenly stood upright from his workstation. "I found it." Every conversation stopped. Charlotte turned immediately. "Found what?" The technician pointed toward the monitor. "The original trigger event." Another specialist hurried over. "Let me see." Within seconds, multiple engineers surrounded the screen. Data was compared. Calculations were checked. Reports were opened side by side. Then the lead technician slowly leaned back in his chair. His expression carried equal parts relief and disbelief. "We have been chasing a symptom." Complete silence followed. Charlotte folded her arms. "Meaning?" The technician looked directly at her. "The primary fault is not where we thought it was." Another engineer nodded. "Not even close." Across the room, Jake closed his eyes briefly. Not because he felt victorious. Because the evidence had finally spoken for itself. Charlotte noticed. So did several technicians. For the first time, nobody in the service bay was looking at Jake like an outsider. They were looking at him like someone who belonged there. And as the team continued uncovering one overlooked clue after another, a realization slowly spread through the dealership. The man who had been denied an interview might understand this vehicle better than anyone in the building. The discovery transformed the atmosphere inside Harrison Luxury Motors. What had started as a routine diagnostic challenge had become something much larger. Technicians no longer spoke with certainty. They spoke with curiosity. Engineers who had spent days defending conclusions were now revisiting assumptions. The deeper they looked, the more evidence supported the same realization. The original diagnosis had been wrong, not because anyone lacked skill, because everyone had been looking in the same direction. And sometimes that is exactly where mistakes hide. Charlotte Hayes remained in the service department long after sunset. She watched specialists compare reports and review system histories. Every new finding pointed toward the same truth. The overlooked trigger event had changed everything. The expensive repair everyone feared might not be necessary. The vehicle might be fully recoverable after all. Across the room, Jake Sullivan stood quietly near a workbench. He had no interest in taking control of the process. He simply answered questions when people asked them. Nothing more. Several technicians gathered around him. "How did you learn to spot things like this?" one asked. Jake smiled. "A lot of years." Another technician laughed. "That is not an answer." Jake shrugged. "It is the only one I have." Charlotte watched the exchange carefully. The respect in the room had become impossible to miss. Employees who ignored him hours earlier now listened whenever he spoke. Greg Walters noticed it too. Unfortunately, the realization seemed to make him increasingly uncomfortable. Around 9 o'clock, Charlotte stepped into her office to review personnel records. One question continued bothering her. Who exactly was Jake Sullivan? The answer appeared within minutes. Then she stopped reading and stared silently at the screen. His resume had never been reviewed. Greg had returned it unopened. So Charlotte opened the digital copy attached to the original application. The first page surprised her. The second page shocked her. The third page left her speechless. Certifications, awards, industry recognition, leadership roles, consulting projects, technical publications. Jake Sullivan was not simply experienced. He was one of the most respected diagnostic specialists in the country during the peak of his career. Charlotte continued reading. Then she found the gap. Several years with almost no professional activity. She searched deeper. The explanation appeared in a short article buried inside an industry publication. After the loss of his wife, Jake had stepped away from executive opportunities and national projects to raise his daughter full-time. Charlotte slowly leaned back in her chair. Suddenly everything made sense. The humility, the patience, the complete absence of ego. Jake was not trying to prove anything because he had already achieved everything people usually spend their lives chasing. Meanwhile, in the service department, technicians continued reviewing data. One of them finally looked up from a workstation. The repair plan works. Another technician checked the numbers again. It really works. Excitement spread through the room. The vehicle was not beyond saving. The solution had been there all along, hidden beneath an incorrect assumption. Charlotte returned to the service bay carrying a printed copy of Jake's resume. Greg noticed immediately. His face lost color. "Where did you get that?" Charlotte looked directly at him. "The application you never reviewed." Silence followed. Several nearby employees glanced toward the manager. Charlotte turned the first page toward the technicians. "Do any of you know who this man is?" They looked confused. Then they began reading. One by one, expressions changed. Surprise, disbelief, respect. A senior technician looked up first. "You did all of this?" Jake smiled awkwardly. "A long time ago." "Why did you never mention it?" another asked. Jake looked toward a photograph on his phone screen. A picture of Lily from a recent school event. Because none of it was the most important thing I ever did. Nobody spoke for a moment. The answer landed with unexpected weight. Charlotte folded the resume and looked at him carefully. They turned away one of the best people in the industry without even opening the application. Greg stared at the floor. Jake immediately shook his head. People make mistakes. Charlotte smiled faintly. That may be the most generous thing anyone has said all week. Around them, the service department continued working toward the final repair plan. Yet something more important than the vehicle had already been repaired. The assumptions. The judgments. The belief that appearances tell the whole story. And as the evening grew later, everyone inside Harrison Luxury Motors began understanding a lesson they would never forget. The most valuable person in the building had been standing in front of them all along. 3 days later, the service department gathered around the luxury vehicle one final time. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of Harrison Luxury Motors, reflecting across polished floors and chrome surfaces. The atmosphere felt completely different from the frustration that had filled the building only a week earlier. The revised repair plan had been completed. Every system had been inspected. Every diagnostic sequence had been verified. The vehicle was ready. Charlotte Hayes stood beside the lead technician while employees quietly assembled around the service bay. Nobody had been ordered to attend. They simply wanted to witness the ending. Greg Walters stood near the back of the group. His expression carried the weight of a lesson he would not forget. Across the room, Jake Sullivan was helping organize tools with the same calm focus he had shown since the beginning. Nothing about his behavior suggested he expected recognition. Nothing about him suggested he believed he had won anything. To Jake, the most important part of the story had never been proving someone wrong. It had been helping solve a problem. His phone buzzed. A message from Lily appeared on the screen. Did the car survive? Jake smiled and typed a short reply. We are about to find out. Moments later, Charlotte stepped forward. Ready? The lead technician nodded. Ready. The room fell silent. A final system check appeared on the monitor. Green indicators filled the screen one by one. Then the technician initiated the startup sequence. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then the vehicle responded exactly as it should. Smooth, stable, healthy. Diagnostic screens confirmed normal operation across every major system. The silence lasted only a moment before relief spread throughout the room. Technicians smiled. Advisors exchanged looks of disbelief. Several employees quietly applauded. The lead technician stared at the monitor and laughed softly. I cannot believe it. Another engineer shook his head. We were looking in the wrong place the entire time. Charlotte turned toward Jake. For several seconds, she simply looked at him. Then she crossed the room. Every conversation stopped again. Jake, she said. He looked up. Yeah. Charlotte held out a folder. This should have happened the first day you walked through our doors. Jake opened it. Inside was a formal employment offer. Not for the technician position he originally applied for. A senior leadership role overseeing diagnostics and technical operations across multiple locations. Several employees smiled immediately. Greg lowered his eyes. The room waited for Jake's response. Charlotte spoke again. The position comes with every benefit we can offer. The salary is more than competitive. And frankly, after what happened here, it is the least we can do. Jake looked down at the offer, then toward the window, then at a photograph of Lily on his phone. The room remained silent. Finally, he smiled. Can I ask one question? Charlotte nodded. Of course. Will I still have time to pick up my daughter from school? A few people laughed softly. Charlotte smiled. Yes. Will I still be able to attend her school events? Absolutely. Jake closed the folder. Then I would be honored. The room erupted into applause. Not because of the job offer. Because everyone understood what truly mattered to him. Greg stepped forward next. The moment seemed difficult for him. Jake. Jake turned. Greg took a breath. I owe you an apology. Jake remained quiet. I judged you before I knew anything about you. The manager looked genuinely embarrassed. I should have opened the resume. Jake smiled gently. We all miss things sometimes. The answer somehow made the apology even harder to hear. Charlotte noticed several employees nodding. Respect filled the room. Genuine respect. Not for Jake's accomplishments. Not for his resume. For his character. Later that afternoon, Jake picked Lily up from school. She climbed into the truck and immediately noticed the folder on the seat. What happened? Jake handed it to her. Her eyes widened as she read the offer. Dad, He smiled. Yeah. Lily looked at him for several seconds before throwing her arms around him. I told you they were wrong. Jake laughed quietly. As they drove home beneath the golden light of the setting sun, neither of them said much. They did not need to. Some victories do not arrive with celebrations. Some arrive with peace. The dealership had discovered the truth about a vehicle. More importantly, it had discovered the truth about a man. And in the end, the loudest moment was not the applause, the job offer, or the repaired machine. It was the quiet dignity of a father who never stopped being kind, even when the world failed to see his worth. If this story reminded you of someone who kept going despite being overlooked, share their story in the comments. And if you believe character matters more than appearances, we would be honored to have you join us again for another story about grace, resilience, and second chances.